Hello, and welcome to Crash Course Sensory Processing. Here, we will define sensory processing, discuss its connection to autism spectrum disorder, and explore ways in which those experiencing sensory difficulties might be supported. Throughout this video, we will also be hearing the perspectives of clinicians who have worked closely with this population, as well as review quotes from individuals and caretakers of individuals on the autism spectrum. So what is sensory processing? Sensory processing is the way that our bodies receive, organize, and understand sensory information in the environment through our 7 sensory systems. Did you know there are actually 7 senses? You're probably familiar with the main 5 senses: smell, taste, hearing, sight, and touch. But there are 2 lesser-known senses called proprioception and vestibular. Proprioception is the ability to sense your body's position. This sense uses receptors in our muscles to help us understand where our body is in space and helps us to prepare to interact with objects in our environment. Climbing through a tunnel requires proprioceptive skills in order to understand what is above and below our body and successfully position ourselves inside.
One area with sensory processing that I really tend to focus on is the proprioceptive system. And so that's the system, kind of where receptors are in our muscles and joints, and it is triggered when we are engaged in more physical activity or against resistance, so the pushing, pulling, climbing kinds of activities. So I will often work with children and families on trying to incorporate more of those types of activities. That it can be very calming for the body to get more. Sometimes it's deep pressure input, and sometimes it's more active resistance. So either one, depending on the child's system. So looking for those kinds of activities and helping families figure out, are there chores that the child can do where they would get more of that input, carrying things in, pulling a wagon, pushing laundry baskets. So I will often start with that, no matter what else is going on with the child, just to help try to get more regulation, modulation in that body.
Vestibular senses how our body is moving through space. Our bodies have specific receptors that can sense if we are moving up and down or side to side, and helps us to maintain our balance and equilibrium. Bouncing on a yoga ball or trampoline and swinging on a swing are all examples of activities that use our vestibular sense. Research has shown that up to 95% of people with autism spectrum disorder experience sensory processing differences. It is included in the DSM criteria for autism as a form of restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. Although not all individuals with ASD may experience these sensory processing differences negatively, for many they can significantly impact the way they interact with others, complete daily living skills, and overall how they live their everyday life. By better understanding some of these differences, we can be better advocates, self-advocates, and supports for those on the autism spectrum.
It's important to remember that each day doesn't look the same, just as a day doesn't look the same for typical developing individuals either for children, right? So sometimes it depends on they're getting a cold, or they had poor sleep the night before, or they just had a rough start to the day because maybe they aren't wearing the clothes that they really wanted to wear. I mean, I have favorite outfits too, and when I realize that they're dirty and I can't wear them, it makes me not have quite the same start as if I could wear, what makes me more comfortable. And so when you have sensory processing on top of that, the days are going to look different. So someday a child might tolerate certain sounds a little bit better than another day, and it might also be related to how much sleep they've had, or if they're getting a cold, or somebody might have touched them just before. So I think it's not a physical disability that you can see, and what we see is just their participation and function. But development is so complicated with so many dynamic systems, and that's really important to remember.
The thing I'd add is that I think we all respond to sensory things different. We all have sensory processing differences. So, think about ourselves and what makes us more comfortable and less comfortable, and it may help us be able to understand how people with autism may have different responses as well.
As mentioned, there are many different ways that people can experience and interpret sensory information. Using Dunn's model of sensory processing, we can organize and understand some of the many different experiences people have with sensory input. The first factor we need to consider is a person's threshold for sensory input. Similar to when someone says they have a high threshold for pain, some people have a high threshold for sensory input, meaning that they require or can handle a large amount of input before their body reacts to it. Alternatively, when someone has a low threshold for sensory input, this means that they require very little sensory input before they realize its presence or react to it. The next factor we need to consider is the type of response someone has in reaction to receiving certain sensory input. If someone has a passive response to input, that means they might acknowledge its presence but will not react to this information. Someone with an active response to sensory input will do something once receiving this input, for example, responding with an emotional or physical reaction. When we combine the two factors of thresholds and responses, we can begin to categorize some of the sensory differences that people experience. It is important to note that the combinations we discuss can be applied to any of the 7 senses. Just because someone belongs in one category for touch input doesn't mean they are in the same category for hearing input. First, we are going to look at the combination of a high threshold and a passive response. This combination can be referred to as registration or low registration. This means that they require a lot of sensory input in order to acknowledge its presence in their environment, but do not show any response to this input once it is acknowledged. An example of someone who might be considered low registration for the sense of smell may not notice or completely disregard a very potent scent that others would easily notice or be bothered by.
I think children with the opposite extreme too, they don't respond to sensory as much as other children might. So they can fall and get hurt and be bleeding and never show any indication of pain. For a child once who would go out, love to walk out in the snow without shoes on, but really looking for real strong sensory input because it wasn't registering to them. So it can go both ways. They can be very sensitive, but also undersensitive as well, and both can impact their life.
The next combination we will discuss is having a high threshold and an active response to sensory input. This is known as seeking or sensory seeking. Similar to low registration, someone who is sensory seeking requires a large amount of sensory input before they realize or acknowledge its presence. However, these individuals will actively respond to this input or need for input by seeking out different experiences that are more intense. For example, someone who is considered sensory seeking for the sense of taste might actively seek or prefer foods that are very spicy or flavorful in order to fulfill their high threshold for taste. The combination of having a low threshold and a passive response to sensory input is considered sensory sensitivity. These individuals, because of their low threshold for sensory input, may notice sensations that others do not or are often easily ignored. However, despite this sensitivity, they exhibit a passive response. For example, someone who is sensitive to sound might notice or become distracted by sounds that others can easily ignore, such as a fan blowing in the background of a room. The last category that we will discuss is the combination of a low threshold and an active response to sensory input. This is referred to as avoiding or sensory avoiding. If an individual is sensory avoiding to touch input, they may actively find ways to avoid certain textures that are unappealing to them, such as removing uncomfortable clothing or avoiding messy textures. As mentioned before, sensory differences can affect participation in daily activities both positively and negatively. Currently, most of the research regarding these effects is focused on the difficulties individuals face when sensory input cannot be regulated easily. In the education setting, difficulty processing sensory input has been found to increase anxiety and withdrawal in preschool-age students with ASD. Decreased attention skills have also been correlated with school-age children with ASD and sensory processing difficulties. Sensory processing difficulties can also impact social participation within the autism population. Elements of specific environments can be overwhelming for some people with sensory processing differences, making group participation at specific locations difficult. When interviewed in a 2017 research project, a parent discussed the experience of receiving birthday invitations for her child's classmates.
I think even people get used to what their response is going to be, so that even anticipating being in a situation where one of those sensory experiences is going to be present can increase their anxiety level and, have a really pervasive influence over their lives, make them nervous about going and participating in activities and things that their peers and other family members can enjoy that they find, really anxiety provoking. I think there are positives as well, though, because they, might have a real good ear for tunes and, have a real strong abilities in musical kinds of things, or have some strong visual skills where they can pick out details and things that other people don't pick out. So I think it's important to point out that there could be positives in their sensory strengths as well as the negatives it has on their lives.
Other daily activities such as dressing, grooming, eating, leisure, and sleep can also be affected by sensory processing difficulties. When analyzed, these are very sensory demanding activities and can be considered multisensory experiences. Eating in mealtime, for example, requires processing not only taste and smell sensation, but also tactile input from foods of different textures and proprioceptive feedback from foods of different thicknesses or consistencies. From here, depending on the environment in which the meal is being eaten, an individual may be more or less successful. A bright and noisy cafeteria or food court might be more difficult to handle than a quiet lunch at home. Temple Grandin, a prominent scholar and member of the autism community, discussed in one of her articles the difficulties she faced as a child during dressing and grooming tasks. Luckily, there are many researched sensory strategies and accommodations that can be used to support individuals on the autism spectrum who are also facing sensory processing differences. Two broad approaches involve changing environmental factors to make them more tolerable for an individual, like using dimming sheets to reduce the harsh light from LED bulbs, or using techniques that reduce behavioral responses from an individual caused by certain types of sensory input, such as using noise-canceling headphones in an environment that is predictably loud. There are often many universal solutions to common sensory difficulties as well. More universal solutions, such as deep breathing or yoga for regulation before or after emotional responses caused by sensory input, weighted blankets for calming proprioceptive input, or adaptive seating for increased vestibular input, are becoming more and more common and easily available. Still, many sensory-based interventions are focused on the individual and their own unique combinations of needs and may require more of a personalized approach. This is where the work of an occupational therapist might provide support and suggestions to increase independence and function during daily life. An OT's intervention in this area is often focused on evaluating and practicing sensory strategies, techniques, and solutions that prove successful for a specific individual. From here, the OT can provide parents, caretakers, teachers, or other professionals with support and education regarding factors such as increasing understanding of the individual's needs and experiences with sensory processing difficulties, improving areas of performance that may be affected by sensory processing difficulties, maximizing and utilizing the individual's strengths, and maintaining the individual's overall health and wellness. The ability to process and modulate sensory information is essential for active participation in daily occupations. Therefore, the evaluation and treatment of these areas of need align with the founding principles of OT and attempt to improve quality of life for individuals of all abilities. There are many ways society can make everyday experiences more accommodating for people with sensory differences. With increased understanding of these experiences, settings like schools have become much more accommodating and aware of sensory needs. Creativity and a willingness to learn can inspire changes that can benefit everyone.
Well, the sensory-friendly events that are, that people are starting to, organizations are starting to promote a little bit more, I think are wonderful. I recently had a wonderful experience at NAS. I went to it was a children's performance. It was the Rainbow Fish with my 2-year-old grandson. And the one we went to happened to be the sensory-friendly performance. And so the lights were on the whole time. There were fidgets that were provided for the children. There was, more of a tolerance as far as children making comments or noises, or kind of moving around in the aisle, and that's not tolerated always, or accepted by other individuals. At a performance, or in a theater, they would be shushing and telling children. And I have to say, it was very inclusive for me having a 2-year-old, because he needs the same thing, and so for him to be able to stand and sit and move around, I didn't feel bad at all. And if we had been at a different performance, I would have been more concerned about what people were going to be saying. So some of it's people understanding that everyone has differences, and so I think some of it's people being accepting of all people and all differences. But I think the sensory friendly events are a great start to that. So I'm really happy that we're seeing more of those in our community.
I think more and more awareness, so people don't make assumptions when they see, a child in the grocery store who may not be behaving the way they think that the outsider thinks they should, and making assumptions that the parent isn't parenting well or doing what they should be doing. We did this focus group once with parents of kids with autism, and trying to figure out where in this school they could improve the services for the kids with autism there. And I think that one of the overwhelming things that parents were saying was just increasing awareness overall, that even their siblings felt more comfortable being a sibling of somebody with autism when everybody in the school understood, the little idiosyncrasies of the children with autism, and just being more accepting and more aware, and not making assumptions that it's maybe an intentional behavior or an intentional kind of thing that the person's doing to, for whatever reason.
Are you looking to expand your knowledge even further? There are plenty of helpful resources that discuss sensory processing and autism, and can be found through the links attached to this video. I hope you enjoyed this crash course tutorial into how sensory processing may play a role in the lives of people with ASD, and were able to learn something new. Please feel free to leave questions or comments below, and if you are able, take the quick post survey attached to this video discussing your knowledge and awareness of this topic. Thanks for watching!